Welcome back, and thank you for joining us tonight. If you enjoy these stories, you can support our journey by subscribing to this channel and leaving a small sign of encouragement. It means more than you know. This is part 3 of Silent Katana. You are here for the first time. I kindly recommend beginning with part 1, The Return of Silence, and part 2, The Exile's Path, so the story may unfold for you from the very beginning. For those who have already walked this road, welcome once again. Tonight, the silence deepens, and the storm begins to gather.
Night settled by degrees, a careful hand dimming the world until only what mattered remained. On the ridge, where scrub pine clung to the stone with a patient grip, Takeshi and Nobu stood in the lee of a boulder shaped by seasons into a seat. For men who accept long hours. Below them, the valley loosened its features and arranged itself into bands of darkness and ember. Torches wandered like restless stars. Campfires held their small territories, and wind pulled long breaths through. Torn banners tied to improvised poles. The banners answered with a dry, flayed whisper, their edges combed into fringes by weeks of weather, their devices blurred and stubborn Dago's burned wing crossed where a seal might sit. The old marks of Kinsei's domain bleached to persistence. The storm that had promised itself all afternoon worked at its promise without hurry. Thunder spoke along the far hills the way hollow drums speak in storehouses half sound, half body rolling under the earth and back again, shaping silence without breaking it. Lightning showed itself as a far silvering of cloud, a sheet lifted, for an instant and placed down again, as if the sky were examining its own stitching. The air held the smell of wet pine and turned earth, resin lifted by damp, roots preparing to drink. The faint iron the wind learned when it skimmed a river and found it waiting. Takeshi did not sit. He let the ridge decide his posture. Cloak, pulled close, not cinched snug at the wrist. He rested the palm of one hand lightly on the stone, as if to take the ridge's measure without asking it to change. Beside him, a step back and to the left, Nobu fitted his breath to the hour quiet in. Quiet out until his chest made the steady rise and fall of a man who has agreed to be patient. Horses somewhere below refused the agreement. Their breathing came in soft, uneasy plumes, then short stamps against wet boards, then the scuff of hooves seeking better ground. In that animal sound, the valley made a confession it would never write down. Between gusts, voices floated up, a man counting, a man laughing too loudly at a joke that tasted of worry, a sergeant's low scold, the thin, bright ring of a cup set against iron. Then wind returned, and the torches spoke in their own dialect. Flames humbled to narrow blue at the bases. Yellow tongues drawing lines along rain-polished wood, smoke laying itself flat and then blown sideways like a sleeve tugged by an impatient hand. The fires kept their discipline, littered with boards and stones, their light released only where the wind demanded. Around each, men held their shapes like figures cut from thicker darkness. A shoulder, a hand stirring a pot, a knee bent and held. Heads that turned in unison toward the same sound, then away. Count the gaps, Takeshi murmured the words. Carried no farther than a pine's lower branch, Nobu's eyes moved without haste. From the river bend, he whispered, 3 fires, then a space as wide as 2 fields, then 4. The space is watched from the thorn. Their watchers stand by the ground that looks empty. Takeshi inclined his head a fraction. The motion spun itself within the cloak. A gust came hard enough to push the banner on the central rise until its pole flexed. Then again harder so that cloth snapped and laid straight for a beat, the wing device stiff and expressionless. The thunder followed, nearer, as if the land had rolled its weight onto one hip to face the storm fully. They listened. The ridge had a way of teaching names to sounds. Far downwind, saddle leather creaked and halted, then creaked again as a rider shifted, bored and wet. Nearer, harness chattered as a strap found its own rhythm on a post. A dog gave one bark, the sound of a creature that has opinions, not authority, and received a hush in reply. The valley itself breathed, belly low with weather, and the breath carried the taste of old ash, cold rice, boiled barley, lamp oil. The breath told stories without choosing them. A patrol crossed the river on the shallow ford, 2 figures and their shadows. Their torches swung wide and then steadied as the men found the purchase they expected. Nobu watched the swinging and learned the timing of feet on slick stone. He marked the moment when reflection met flame and divided one torch into 4. Then 2, then 1 again, as the water lost interest. "Listen for what stops," Takeshi said, a line from training that meant more at night. Nobu let the valley enter him as a list he did not have to recite. The chitter of insects faltered and returned. A kettle rattled its lid and then went calm. The horse stamping at the corral paused, stood, blew, resumed. Somewhere a low drum began 2 beats, then a space, then 2, the rhythm of men testing. Not their courage, only their instructions. Thunder rolled over it and took its measure without malice. On their ridge, pine began to sweat with mist. Needles darkened, bent, lifted again. Bark let the faint incense of resin, a clean sweetness that felt like a memory one cannot place. The stone beneath Takeshi's palm cooled by a degree and held there. The first fine spray touched Nobu's cheek and did not yet travel farther. Lightning again, closer, a layer peeled and folded. For the length of a breath, the valley flattened to ink on paper. Tents drawn in quick strokes, posts made crisp, firelight blocked into rectangles, the river a pale band. Then darkness, and the torches reclaimed their star work. "Do you see him?" Nobu asked, not looking up, the you meaning. Dago and also every man who warmed his hands in the shape of command. "No," Takeshi said. "He prefers small rooms inside large ones." Nobu nodded, which in the night was a thought passed to his shoulders. He mapped again, the outlying watchers under the thorn, the reserve near the central staff, the cooks working too quickly, the men who sat with weapons balanced across thighs because they feared sleep would take them the way death takes a house quietly. Then entirely, he found the empty ground south of the river bend, the place he had misnamed empty earlier, and listened harder. There was a sound there after all, not footsteps, not talk, but the absence of both arranged on purpose. A held breath as wide as a field. He wondered who had told silence to stand there. A fox passed along the ridge behind them, invisible but exact, paws pressing into the mat of needles with care. It carried the careful smell of wet fur and old leaves, a domestic odor, lent to a wild intention. It paused, considered the 2 men, then moved on, unoffended by their stillness. When it was gone, the pine swayed once. A green dog the long watch asked for small economies. Takeshi shifted his weight from one foot to the other to let warmth travel along bone. Nobu loosened and retied the knot at his wrist to keep the hand. Honest, both men blinked in the pattern the hour prefers, long and slow, to allow dark to continue being itself. Across the basin, a gust lifted a string of prayer slips from the lintel of a border shrine, and the slips flapped against the wood with the soft syllables of fish mouths, back and forth, until the wind tired and the consonants went quiet. Time passed the way weather does at night without telling its name. The campfires settled into their late shapes, flames trimmed down to coal and covered, only a low breathing of red showing where heat refused to be caged. Men arranged themselves around them, knees drawn, hands tucked, faces pointed toward the glow as if each were a small east. The horses in the corral found a consensus and shifted all at once toward the leeward rails. Flank to flank, their restive voices reduced to the occasional grumble. A flute tried 2 notes under a tent flap skeptical. soft, and was answered by a sergeant's murmur that did not carry words. Only a closing of a door. "Stay with the river," Takeshi said, not as order but as direction for the eye. Nobu's gaze returned to the pale band. He followed it to where it entered the camp and how the tents had been set to acknowledge and not impede it. He looked to where it widened and slowed into a shallow that might decide to change its mind by morning. He learned its bends the way a reader learns a sentence by the breath it takes. A drop struck his sleeve. He glanced at the spot and then ignored it, the way a soldier ignores an itch during a bell. The wind rose and lowered and rose again, lifting the torn banners into motions they could not choose. The cloth gave back a hash of sound, like old paper consulted by many hands. On the central rise, the winged strip cracked again, edges glowing briefly when lightning backlit it, a drawing of flight that had never left the pool. Thunder came. Afterward, slower, then faster, as if finding its road among the hills. Without moving his mouth much, Nobu asked, "Will they come tonight?" "They are already coming," Takeshi said. "Even when they sleep?" The boy absorbed that and let it settle in the same cupboard where he kept knots and blade oil and the way to step into gravel without announcing himself. Beneath the storm smell, another thread of air passed the sour of wet hemp, the sweetness of steaming rice, the fine bitterness of ink left uncapped. Someone was signing orders under canvas and believing them. Someone else, across the river, spat and decided to wait. Takeshi shifted his palm from the stone to the hilt at his hip and back again. The gesture a conversation between cold and warm, between work and the hand that does it. He remembered Sayori's line about storms, not from heaven, but from men, and thought how faithfully the sky now agreed to carry one. Lightning again, nearer. The ridge caught that brief glare and offered it to their eyes without demand. Nobu lowered his gaze during the white and raised it after, like a pupil used to the discipline of a strict teacher who also teaches. Mercy dot when the thunder rolled this time, it trembled the scrub at their calves and set a thread of water moving. Under the rock, a low sound like breath taken under a blanket. The smell of wet earth intensified, not yet mud, the rich brown of ground about to be written upon. The ridge's pine spoke in sentences, the hush of needles, the creak of heartwood, the tick of sap waking. Somewhere in the corral, a horse, shivered skin from shoulder to flank, a ripple that found the next animal and the next until all had agreed to be one body for a breath. A torch down in the basin went out, then another. A man hurried with a fresh brand along a line of stakes and relit what the wind had taken. The relit flames leaned together as if conferring. Nobu counted how long it took each to stand again and learned something about the dryness of the bundle and the damp of the hour. He marked the place where the torchbearer paused longer, the entrance to a tent that did not want attention and took it anyway. He saw the sergeant there lift a flap and keep it held against wind while someone inside finished with paper. He did not need to see the man's face to recognize the shape of the hand that had ordered him to do it. They did not speak for a long while. The ridge required that. Wind used the lull to test the angles of their cloaks and found no leverage. Hail threatened and thought better of itself. The thunder's voice deepened toward something like fatigue and then, after a rest, returned with renewed appetite, not rage. Not theater, only resolve. Through it all, the valley's small sounds kept on. The clatter of a ladle against a pot, the click of chopsticks, fewer now. The long, tired exhale of a man lying down and emitting it. Nobu stood all this and learned to stand longer by standing. The knot at his wrist remained true. His hand knew the weight of the hilt and did not clutch it. His eyes softened to let dark be shapely. He felt the ridge beneath his sandals, the slight give of lichened rock, the faint chill bleeding through it, and understood why old soldiers speak well of good ground. "Master," he said at last as the sky pulled its sheet lower. When the storm ends, the work begins, Takeshi said. And if it does not end, then we keep watch, he answered, not unkindly. The torches below flickered again and held. Banners tugged and breathed and lay flat and breathed again. The smell of wet pine grew clean as a shrine at dawn. The horses in the shadows stamped and were quiet. The ridge waited for the hour to choose itself. Lightning drew a thin line between two hills and stepped back. Thunder rolled its drum along the valley floor and lifted it to the ridge and set it down without breaking. Everything held. The storm crossed some private border then, the line between threat and arrival simple as a drop. The first of it found Takeshi's chica cool, distinct touch that rode a single vertical on his skin and went lower into the collar without apology. He closed his eyes once, not long, not to rest, only as one accepts a seal pressed in two. Paper acknowledgement of the shape, the weight, the consequence. When he opened them, the valley was still the valley. Fires breathing, banners speaking, horses adjusting their balance, men lying awake under wet canvas and thinking of orders. In other weather, rain began to patter on stone in an even hand. It found armor and found its particular music there. It laid itself into earth that had longed all day to be darkened, and the ridge breathed with the storm as if the two had known each other for years. In that breath, Takeshi and Nobu kept their watch, and the night, made solemn by what it carried, kept them. Rain learned the ridge by heart and began to stroke it in long, even lines. The night drew its wet curtain tighter around the valley, and the fires below sank to red breathing. Their light held under stones and pots, their smoke flattened and persuaded to the ground. Thunder rolled low and unambitious along the distant hills. A cart of hollow drums pulled without hurry. In the lee of the boulder, Takeshi and Nobu kept their places, cloaks heavy with the clean weight of weather, faces turned to the sound more than to the sight. Water gathered in the needle clusters above and released itself in patient drops, ticking on stone, ticking on leather, ticking on the bronze rivets of Nobu's bracer with a rhythm that learned his pulse and then corrected it. Wind came and went a slow hand at their backs, smelling of wet pine and cold iron and the damp sweetness of soil accepting its duty. Sometimes the gusts pulled the torn banners on the valley's central rise into straight lines, and the burned wing mark went rigid. Sometimes the cloth hung with all the fatigue cloth can wear and still be cloth, edges combed to threads by weeks of weather. They heard the horses before they saw them, the close herd in the makeshift corral shifting their weight in the dark, tails scissoring, leather knocking wood. The low complaint of a creature that wishes to step out of its own skin for a moment and cannot. A man down there coughed and covered the sound with his palm, and rain erased it. Another man stirred coals that did not want to be bright, found them red at the core, nodded to himself, and lowered the lid again. Thunder rolled once more, longer now, as if speaking to the river about its options. Nobu's hand tightened on his sword hilt when the ridge made a new sound, too heavy for fox, too careful for deer, too honest for wind. It came from the slope behind them, not from the valley, the sound of weight testing loose gravel, and then, deciding not to announce itself, the soft pull of cloth across low juniper. A breath held and let out through the nose, so it would not steam where torches might catch it. He felt the boulders cold through the wool as his shoulder pressed in pressure that his body answered without thinking. The way a tree leans a finger's breadth more when the gust asks that Takeshi did not turn. He put his palm flat to the stone and let it conduct the approach to him. The coming was not a rush and not a stall. It understood the ridge the way a man understands a room he has entered without wanting to be noticed, the places that betray him, the places that forgive, the places that welcome an ally. Nobu's breath went narrower, then found its shape again. Rain ticked on the back of his hand and ran under the guard, a cold thread reminding him where bone meets skin. When the shape arrived, it remained a shape man-sized and vaguely armored, head a darker oval in a darkness the storm had taught to hold itself. For a time the three of them shared only weather. Then the newcomer shifted enough that a thin wash of light from the valley struck the arc of a helmet bowl and ran off it. For an instant the metal showed a dull lacquer, chipped near the rim, with a shallow dent that gathered rain into itself and then shed it over the ear guard. The figure paused again, waiting for the thunder's exhale, and in that rumble spoke low and careful, the voice meant for a ridge and not for a yard. 2 on the stone, he said, north of the broken milestone. Takeshi answered in the same tone. 2 who have chosen not to sleep. The man waited for another roll to cover the next exchange. Lightning pressed pale into cloud, did not crack, withdrew. Rain hissed on needles. From Kinsei's house, the figure said. Sent by order. I carry words for Takeshi. Nobu's fingers tightened once more. Takeshi did not move his palm from the rock, but his jaw set against the drop that chose that moment to travel from cheek to collar. He let the thunder come closer and gain weight. In the valley, then asked in modest voice, Whose handwriting? Spoken, not written, the man said, and the answer fell between them like a small stone that might be a key and might be nothing. Then whose mouth? The pause showed a man choosing care. I was given the words by Captain Matsuda. He received them while the Lord listened. Nobu brought his weight forward a half-finger's breadth. Matsuda was a name a ridge could accept. Takeshi allowed the rain time to find a new seam in the cloak and continue its patient work before he spoke again. Show your throat, Takeshi said softly. The shape obeyed. A hand lifted, then the other. Cloth went back. The reek upward light found wet skin, pulse steady, a scar that had healed without pride. The smell of him reached them, wet hemp, horse, iron, and the tannic ghost of parchment that has ridden an oilskin, a metallic tang where ink can smell like a small forgery of blood. Water ran from the rim of his helmet in strings and beat a delicate patter on the oiled packet under his breastplate. He stood still long enough for the ridge to memorize him. Move no closer, Takeshi said, or do, but with the slowness a boulder respects. The man moved with that slowness, 3 steps to the low fold of ground where the boulder's shadow thickened, knee bending into the wet needles, palm turned open to show no trick. Nobu let his thumb feel the cord below the guard and found it true. A gust swelled. The messenger leaned into it and found balance. When thunder came this time, it hung to their bones longer. A long drum passage played in a sealed storehouse. Speak then, Takeshi said. First, the man answered, the house does not sleep. The bell has rung in the second watch and will ring again. The Lord has ordered the lower gates braced. The stores are shut. No messenger leaves by the main road. He spoke as one taught to report simply. Second, he paused, not to collect memory, but to choose caution. The Lord sends no order of engagement. He says the line between storm and men is not to be mistaken. Nobu stared past the man to the valley. The torches below pooled and broke in the wind, became wayward stars again. He listened for alarm in the camp and heard none, only the small choreography of men with wet sleeves. He brought his eyes back to the messenger, the way a student brings. His eyes back to a teacher's mouth, even when the lesson is across the yard. Third, the messenger continued, the Lord says, hold silence until the river speaks. What we do must be weather first, steel second. The sentence traveled carefully into the space between stone and skin. It wore Kensei's austerity like a familiar robe. It also wore the comfortable ambiguity of a sentence that could later be said not to mean what it had meant to the man who obeyed it. The messenger lowered his hands. Rain traced his jaw. fell from the chin in 2 lines, found his collar, and disappeared. Nobu smelled the metallic breath of wet steel when the man shifted. "Fourth," the man said. He says your name and adds, "Takeshi knows how to stand where paper pretends to be wind." Nobu cut his eyes to Takeshi, saw nothing, returned them to the messenger's mouth. Thunder spoke behind the next hill, and some small rock loosed itself and ran down a seam. A horse below stuttered a snort and settled because the others did. "Are there more words?" Takeshi asked. "One more," the messenger said. His voice, until now a learned calm, thinned a little as if the sentence he carried did not like the way it felt in a human throat. He says, "At first light, attend at the milestone shrine if the river leaves the ford." He swallowed, then finished, "If the river does not leave it, do not cross." The rich took the words and held them up to Rain. Ween turned the sentence to look at it from another side. It managed to mean something, and its opposite with equal dignity. Nobu's fingers loosened on the hilt, then tightened again because the hand preferred work to the feeling of being between 2 stairs. Who else heard? Takeshi asked. Captain Matsuda, 2 clerks, and the advisor. The last word came a fraction late, a little heavier, as if daubed rather than written. The messenger lifted the oiled packet with 2 fingers. "The mark is here, though the order was spoken." A seal pressed on blank paper to prove proximity. "I do not..." He paused and recalibrated. "I do not pretend it proves purity." "Bring it," Takeshi said. The man advanced the small distance with the care of one who knows that men are sometimes more easily cut by ink than by iron. He held the packet for a long breath at the edge of light where Nobu could see the drops gather on the oilskin and roll, leaving it clean again. Takeshi took it without letting his fingers touch the messenger's. The packet was warm from body heat. The wax under the oil had set. A slow Kensei's had pressed it while soft. Rain now wrote its own marks on the surface, and little beads of water made brief planets that ran, collided, fell away. A smell came up from the packet: animal glue, smoke, and that sharp penny cold of wet parchment. Thunder rounded the hills with a lower voice. Lightning opened a seam in the cloud and stitched it shut again with light, so thin it might have been a stray hair caught between 2 papers. In that thin glare, the messenger's armor showed its poverty plates refit with mismatched cords, a buckled tie at the shoulder where haste had been braided into necessity, a strap hole chewed wider by years of obedience. "When did you leave?" Takeshi asked. "End of first watch," the man said. "Through the postern, under the water chain." The guard knew me. "Who knows you here?" "No one," he said. "I've carried for the house only inward, not outward." "Then who told you where to find us?" Again, the brief stall, the honesty of a man untrained in rehearsed lies. "No one," he said. The ridge and the river tell the same story to anyone who spends time in bad weather. A ghost of a smile that spared his mouth came and went. I looked for men who would be listening too hard for it. Nobu watched the messenger's hands when he answered. They were red with wet and cold, knuckles chafed, a scratch crossed by a smear of darker mud. No wing mark, no fresh ink. He let the breath out he had been holding under his tongue. "Say again," Takeshi said, the words as they were spoken. The man closed his eyes and obliged. "Hold silence until the river speaks. What we do must be weather first still. Second, at first light, attend at the milestone shrine if the river leaves the ford. If the river does not leave it, do not cross." He opened his eyes. He added your name with respect. The advisor listened and did not interrupt. A gust climbed the ridge and shook water from the pine tips, a brief glitter that no one saw. Then a chill as the wind made room for more rain. The valley accepted the new weight and changed tone from patter to a closer hiss. Nobu leaned his shoulder harder into the boulder and felt the stone recite back to him what it had learned tonight. Men moved. Horses stamped, orders murmured, fires kept their breathing. His hand eased on the hilt, but he did not leave it. Did Matsuda say with his eyes? Takeshi asked as if the question were routine. The messenger's breath made a cloud, thin and honest. He said, the man answered, what a man says when he is asked to watch a room he cannot enter. Takeshi accepted the shape of that. He slid the oiled packet into his sleeve where Rain would have to work harder to read it. The wax gave a small blind resistance against cloth and then agreed to stay. He looked into the dark where the man's face was not quite visible. What do you wish me to do with your presents? He asked. Take it as proof I came, the man said. Doubt the rest as you should. The ridge approved of that sentence. Thunder came again, nearer, its underside full of stones. Down N. The basin, a torch flared as wind worried it, and a shadow lunged tall against a tent and then returned to the ground and folded itself into smaller shapes. The horses grouped even tighter to the leeward fence and made one body of themselves, stamping once in a ragged rhythm that the next gust smoothed out. Nobu, after a pause long enough to test whether the knight preferred his question, ventured. A quiet one. Is the Lord well? The messenger did not answer at once. Water dripped from his helmet to his cheek, walked the scar, fell. He sits, the man said finally, as a stone sits. The house breathes around him. Dago? Nobu asked, not hiding the name from Rain. Present, the man said. Like weather that learned a window's size. Takeshi asked nothing more of him. The messenger was a channel the storm had used. To demand more was to make the channel claim ownership of the rain. Will you go back by the same way? Takeshi asked instead. I will go back by no way if the storm allows it. The man answered, and the fatigue in the line was not complaint. If it does not, I will sleep where stones do not argue, and I will return tomorrow by a way that is not the same and not different. You will be watched, Takeshi said. I am counted. The man agreed. For a time they let the weather speak without their help. Rain beat the rim of the messenger's helmet and fell in little ropes. It tapped on Nobu's guard in a series of tiny metal syllables. It laid a sheen on the boulder so even that the stone looked new. The smell of wet steel grew brighter, clean. In the nose, mingling with the animal trace of oiled parchment. Thunder gathered, rolled, dissolved, gathered again, the long, low grammar of a mountain country, making a sentence too big to memorize. Far below, a dog decided to bark once more and was again corrected. Go, Takeshi said at last, without hardness and without invitation. If you are followed, leave them where the stones gain height too quickly for their breath. The man dipped his head, a bow suited to weather and to distance. If you attend at first light, he said, you will know whether the river has chosen politeness, and if it has not, then the shrine will remain a shrine, he said, and nothing more. He stepped back into the juniper, and the slope took him in. Nobu counted 3 steady footfalls and 1 skidding correction, then nothing but rain and needles, then a faint knock of leather on rock farther down. He kept his hand on the hilt until the knight, which had learned the messenger's weight, unlearn it again. They stood with the packet between them, unlooked at. Nobu wanted to ask, do you believe? And he did not. He went as far as, shall we wait? Takeshi said, in the same patient tone he had used for storm, for horses, for hours. Thunder grew louder, rolled its drum under their feet. The pine above them shook its water loose and then relaxed. Down in the basin, the torches went on with their work, and the torn banners climbed and fell, climbed and fell. The smell of wet earth deepened until it felt like a bed one could lie down in and be forgiven. Nobu exhaled into the cloth of his cloak and tasted the iron edge and the breath that had come from the packet. He thought about letters sent and not sent, the way ink can carry a lie more smoothly than steel can, the way a spoken order can draw a circle around a man and leave him unsure. Which side is the inside dot? Takeshi did not open the sleeve to look. He let the weight of the seal make its small argument against his arm. He turned his palm to the rain and felt the drops cool the skin without admitting the cold beneath. He considered the words hold silence, weather first, attend. Do not cross, and he allowed each to be both a command and observation, allowed each to be a warning and a trap. He thought of Kensei seated behind the low desk, hands open on wood, face admitting nothing it did not intend to rule. Of Mitsuda, whose eyes were an honest ledger. Of Daiko, who could make any room into a smaller version of itself. Below, the river shifted its tone imperceptibly, as if rehearing its own voice in a new room. Wind swung and pressed against the ridge, and then released. The horses stamped and grew quiet. Rain thickened until it became something like privacy. Nobu eased his grip at last. The thunder came low and long, and the ridge answered it with a steadying silence, the kind that helps a man sort what to carry and what to set down. He may be warning, Nobu said, finally giving the question the shape of a middle path. May, Takeshi said. He may be sent to find our place, the boy added. He may, Takeshi said again. What will we do? The work, Takeshi said. And whether. A gust leaned into them and moved on, generous with its weight. The packet in Takeshi's sleeve warmed and cooled with his breath. He closed his eyes briefly, not to sleep and not in weariness, but in acceptance of another small seal pressed upon the night. When he opened them, rain still wrote its patient script on stone and leather, and thunder revised what it had already said, and the valley's scattered fires continued to breathe under the storm's careful hand. The messenger, weather warning, or trap, had become part of the ridge's memory, and the ridge, with its long practice of holding men who were not sure what came next, held them both until morning chose its shape. They left the crown of the ridge when the rain thickened from script to slab, slipping down the lee a little way until the rock bent outward like a brow. There the land offered a shallow room, a ledge with a back wall of granite veined pale as bone, a floor of packed needles and grit, a ceiling low enough for the storm to strike and be turned aside. Wind poured past the mouth of the shelter in long, muscular gust howls threaded between the boulders, combed by narrow gaps until each note found its own throat. The valley below lost edges and became a breathing dark, fires hidden under lids. Tents pressed flat, horses folded into themselves like ideas kept from morning. Takeshi set his bundle against the back wall and did not immediately move again. Stillness anchored him. In the flicker that entered from beyond light thrown and withdrawn by lightning, then by the heave of distant flames, he looked carved rather than seated, a figure the cliff had decided to keep. Nobu crouched at the mouth, gathered dry from the driest of wet, torn reed from under a root, threads teased from the heart of a split stick. A shaving he had kept in his pouch for such weather, a paper-thin curl that remembered summer. He cupped flame into being with breath and patient hands, and a small fire took in fits, struggling against damp, losing ground, seizing it back, learning to keep a line of ember along one side, and asking the rest to join. Smoke laid itself low. Unreluctant, wind snatched what it could at the threshold and threw it out into its own larger mouth. Rain struck the earth in sheets that made their own music, not clatter, not hiss, an even drumming that spread across stone and soil until every surface hummed with agreement. From time to time, thunder answered, deeper, moving through the ribs, like a slow bell rung in some unseen hall. Water gathered, ran, found old channels, learned new ones, circled small stones and break collars, and slid away. The fire learned the hour. It did not dare brightness, but it kept a core, a thin red thought around which the rest could organize. Nobu held his hands near it, palms down, then turned them and watched the heat meet the tremor there fine, shaking like a wire kissed by. Waned, the sword lay across his thighs. He had placed it carefully, beyond the reach of stray sparks, but near enough that his fingers could find the cord below the guard and remind themselves of its truth. Drops fell from the rim of his helmet, tapping the scabbard with a metal patience that became part of the rhythm of rain. Takeshi's stillness gathered the little room into one shape. When the wind struck harder, he did not brace so much as accept, letting the force pass through bone to rock, a conversation the mountain had time to conduct. The fire's unsteady light made his cheekbones into ledges and his eyes into dark pools, where the storm could look at itself and remain unflattered. He listened as a man listens when nothing new is needed. Storm, earth, breath, a ledger the night keeps and balances without human help. Between gusts, when rain thinned to a beaded veil, Nobu drew an air that smelled of wet granite, resin teased. Into sweetness, cold iron, a distant animal musk from the valley where horses breathed uneasily. His mind counted back to the messenger on the ridge and the oiled packet now hidden in Takeshi's sleeve. Words that could be warning, could be path, could be snare, had entered the shelter with them, not loud, not even heavy, but present. Found himself rehearsing questions he had not asked and answers that would never be said. And in the rehearsal, his hands found the old tremor, then caught it, then let it go. The fire made a small correction. One flame lifted, touched a shaving, retreated. Another took its place and held. Nobu fed the edge with a sliver and watched the sliver blacken, blister, bloom amber, and turn to a low, useful red. He breathed with it. In the quiet between thunder and its echo, he saw his first body again, the bandit in the pass whose blade had fallen, the boy with the farmer's cap who had looked at his hands and not known them. He saw the spear bound with net cord, the foolish bravery of knots borrowed from boats and taught to behave like war. He felt in his forearms the small hardness that follows correction, shock that fades into understanding and then remains as work. Wind pressed once more, a long hand against the overhang, and howled away along the cliff face, dragging banners somewhere below into straight lines only to let them fall. Nobu looked at Takeshi. The older man's profile was cut clean by the fire's pulse, then soft, then cut again. Nobu realized, without surprise, that he would never see that face ask anything of him but accuracy. He swallowed. Master, he said, and the word had to travel across water to be heard. Takeshi turned his head the width of a finger. Nobu nodded once to himself and began without finishing. When we walked out of the hall, he said, I was a follower. The fire clicked, rain took a breath, thunder rolled a slow agreement along the hills. I watched your feet, Nobu continued, voice small, patient, and the places where you did not put them. I watched your mouth when you chose not to speak. That was enough. The road did not ask anything else of me. The overhang took his words and placed them on the ledge with care, as a housewife puts bowls upside down to. Dry. The storm pressed its ear and then seemed to grant them privacy. Nobu's hands tightened on the scabbard, then eased. He traced the knot, felt the cord's texture, a braid that would not lie for him if his grip became foolish. He lifted his gaze. In the pass, he said, my blade told me what it is. I did not want to speak. It spoke anyway. I am afraid of that voice. He waited for the wind to move through. But I am more afraid of speaking only after you have spoken. Takeshi's eyes were dark openings cut deep, their edges made clean by the fire's discipline. He did not move. I will fight, Nobu said, the words shaped as if he were learning to hold the bowl properly. Not because the path is crowded behind you and I cannot fit. Because the road in front of you is wider when two walk with their eyes open. Rain gathered itself into a heavier sheet and struck the lip of the shelter in a pour that made the small flame falter and then clutch at its own heat. Nobu waited for it to steady. "I will fight," he said again, more slowly, as if guiding truth with both hands. "Not anger's way, not for a name on paper. For the rooms your silence keeps, and for the children who drink from bowls that never learn our names. For the house when it remembers itself. For the river when it refuses false bridges." He stopped. The wind answered by pushing hard enough to make the overhang hum. Water flung itself into the shelter and dissolved on the stone, then retreated, then came again, as weather learning a threshold. Nobu bowed his head to let the gust pass over him and then raised it. "I will not sharpen my blade with anger," he said, voice calm in the pause thunder left. "I will not make noise to prove that I breathe. I will keep the not true and the edge honest. I will carry weight correctly without display. And when we must speak, I will let the words be steel second, weather first." He looked at his trembling hands and accepted them. He lifted them slightly, palms up to the fire, as if warming a pledge he had only now recognized. Drops fell from his sleeves into the ember's light and hissed, each one a small refusal of permanence. "I do not ask for your approval," he said, eyes finding Takeshi's and staying there. "I ask for the work." The wind's tone altered, a little lower, drawn through some new slit in the rocks above. It moaned, then quieted to a long breath that filled the shelter and made it feel full and private at once. The fire held a line of coal along one side and glowed with the calm of a thing that has learned its limits. Smoke moved out in a sheet, then in, then out again. A tide too small for anyone to name loudly. Takeshi did not answer quickly. He let the boy's words arrange themselves where they belonged, some on the ledge, some in the ember, some held by rain on the stone face, some tucked under the blade across Nobu's lap. He lifted his hand from his knee and lowered it again. "Stand where I do not," he said quietly. "Nob, you breathed once," and the breath shook. He closed his fingers on the scabbard and felt the tremor meet the cord and calm. "Do not chase glory," Takeshi added, tone even. "It runs faster than hunger. Do not run from fear. It has longer legs than either of us. Walk with both." "Yes," Nobu whispered. "Keep your mouth closed," Takeshi said, the old line offered as new instruction. "Until speech can save breath. Yes, if you must choose," he said, no heat in it, only steadiness. "Choose the work." Nobu bowed his head. "I will." Outside, the storm found a new force. Wind howled through the rocks with a deep-throated fury that was not anger, only the physics of weather given a voice. Rain struck the slope in sideways chords and broke itself to mist, then gathered again into heavier tears. The overhang shook once, a tremor that moved through the wall behind them and into their backs and then away. The fire pinched down to a coal the size of a coin and held as if it had planted its feet. Nobu fed it with a shaving's width of wood and waited until the shaving agreed to live. He spoke again, and his words came between, half offered to the storm, half kept for the little room. "I will keep faith when no one is counting. I will not spend silence as if noise were currency. I will step to the work even when your feet point elsewhere. If I fall, I will fall toward the task." He stopped, not because he had run out of sayings, but because he understood in the saying that vows do not belong to those who stack them highest. The rain made its thousand-fingered applause against the stone lip and floor. The valley answered with the creak of wood pulled by wet and wind, the low thunder of something distant giving way and then learning its new place. Horses below blew and stamped, the shared body of them shivering in a ripple that folded from fence to fence. "Say your name last," Takeshi said after a while. Let the house be first, Nobu nodded. He whispered his name as if he were placing it under a bowl on the floor, a thing kept safe by being kept simple. Then he lifted his head and shaped the oath at last, the one he had circled and prepared. Without daring to give it breath, "I vow," he said, and the words seemed to take on rain as it went out into the shelter and the night beyond. "I vow to stand when standing is asked, to move when stillness would cost others their bread, to hold my blade where justice can find it and nowhere else. I vow to learn your silence until it becomes my speech. I vow to fight not for noise or for the taste of victory, but for rooms where children sleep without listening for boots, for gates that open in daylight and never close on a man's name. I vow to carry what must be carried, even if the road decides to call me otherwise." Wind surged, took his last syllables and stretched them thin, then laid them back, damp and precise. His voice, lifted barely above the fire's breath, could have been stolen entire, but something remained printed onto the little room as wet leaves are printed onto stone when the sun comes. Takeshi's face did not change. He did not praise, did not correct. He sat very still and allowed the vow to find its own shape in the rock's hearing. When he did move, it was so small a motion that the storm had to be generous to notice it. He nodded once, neither approval nor disapproval, only acceptance, the kind that admits new weight into the ledger without remarking on the sum. The storm took the nod as witness. Rain thickened and ran off the overhang in continuous curtains. The howl in the rocks deepened to a timbre that could have been mistaken for a long drum somewhere under the earth, beating for men who had no time to dance. Thunder rolled in slow, muscular phrases, then paused as if to read what had been spoken. The small fire bent to the gust and stood again. Smoke edged along the ceiling and went out into the night like a signature that knew not to linger. Nobu lowered his head and held his sword more lightly, as one holds a tool after deciding what house to build. His hands still trembled, but the tremor had changed. No longer the aftermath of the past alone. No longer only the messenger's uncertain words, but the body's proper reply to responsibility and honesty that would not leave and did not need to. He breathed and let the trembling stay. "Rest," Takeshi said, "not as order, not as gift, simply as a place in the night." "I will keep the first watch," Nobu answered. "You are keeping it," Takeshi said, and the line settled where it needed to. They arranged themselves closer to the back wall, where spray could not reach and wind arrived only as a thought. The coal kept its patient red. Beyond the lip, the ridge shone in a shallow gloss where water ran, and the valley's scattered lights smoldered under lids the storm kept on for them. The torn banners below were no longer visible, but their whisper had not entirely left the ears. It lived as a faint rasp at the edge of hearing, a memory of cloth speaking thin truth to wind. Nobu let his head touch stone. The stone returned cool and steadiness, took nothing else. He lifted his eyes once more to Takeshi and found that the older man had closed his for the briefest instant, as if sealing something written there against the damp. When they opened, the night resumed without jolt. The storm raged on intact and impartial. In its discipline, the new promise found its seal, and there beneath the overhang the two of them were kept one quiet as stone, one learning to be, and the work waited with the patience of weather. Toward midnight, the storm unstitched itself by inches, not ending so much as loosening its grip. Rain fell thinner, as if the sky had run out of words and was willing to let the land finish the sentence. Takeshi and Nobu left the undercut and the rock where the fire had held a thin red thought, and followed the slope down through pines whose trunks were dark with water to the height of a man's shoulder. Wind combed the needles in slow passes and found a lower voice to use, less howl than breath. Between gusts, the world held still long enough to hear single drops leave high branches and count their way down through smaller ones, patient as beads. Passing a prayer's thumb dot, they moved by smell first, not sight. The clean tar of damp pine smoke drawn through wet boughs. A warmer thread of sake breathing out of a clay jar. The animal edge of wool and wet leather left too near a flame. The earth beneath their sandals had been tamped by many feet and softened by rain. It yielded, then returned, a courtesy learned from years of bearing men who did not ask. Ahead, light leaked and withdrew as if the forest were breathing in rhythm with the embers of a hidden fire. The clearing presented itself without flourish. Pines broke their line and conceded a circle of trodden ground, its edges guarded by mats hung from poles to cheat the wind. Fire sat low in a pit lined by stones blackened to a shine, flames held under a lattice of wet sticks that hissed and then submitted. Torn banners drooped behind the men as if they were shadows that had found cloth to inhabit. A scrap of a crane, its wing eaten by weather. A moon in pieces, a stripe with no crest at all. And along the far side, tied to a pole with a fisherman's knot, a strip of dark cloth whose cross strokes were not painted but burned, 2 lines meeting where a seal might sit, ash cut in the fibers as if the emblem itself smoked slowly. Armor and coats made a humble ring beyond the fire. Men seated on bundles, sword racks, the flat backs of packs. Faces lifted and lowered in the fire's pulse. Scar tissue gleamed where light found it and then went dull again. Hair tied with cords darkened by rain. Cords themselves knotted and re-knotted, the patient handiwork of men who adjust their gear because they cannot adjust the weather. The smell in the clearing was the smell of a storm sheltered, not defeated. Pine smoke doing what it could, sweat and damp cloth wet like old allies. A ghost of iron that had been oiled with cheap oil and resented it. A murmur held the circle together. Arguments without heat, statements spoken as if trying their own weight in public. A cup clicked on a stone. A blade shifted in its sheath with a scrape too honest to conceal. Somewhere beyond the ring, in the understory, an owl sent a single rounded call and then lost interest. Eyes received Takeshi and Nobu, the way a fort receives weather, without surprise and without the courtesy of indifference. The leader of this group, Takeshi, recognized him by the absence of hurry in his posture, by the way others left space around his knees, sat with a patched sleeve, the square of stitching neat and unboastful, beard silvered and trimmed close. A scar curved along his jaw like a river corrected once by a hand and then allowed to keep its new course. He had the look of a man who had long practice being the point at which a room decides what it has already decided. When he spoke, it was not to announce. "Sit," he said. Not a command, not a kindness, merely an arrangement that would please the wind. Takeshi inclined his head and crossed into the ring with the gait of someone who refuses urgency entry to his joints. Nobu followed a step behind and to the left, eyes lowered enough to honor every face and high enough to note every hand. They took a place near a stack of spears whose heads were leaf-shaped but wired to their shafts by cord that had once bound. Fish, and beside a suit of lameller hung to dry like a wet argument, the leader poured from a clay jar and passed 2 cups without insistence. Takeshi accepted one, allowed the steam to meet his lip, and let the taste be no more than it was thin. Clean, the warmth of shared decision rather than indulgence. Nobu held his cup with both hands until the heat corrected his fingers. Around them, the murmur returned, cautious at first, then resumed its earlier traffic now that the strangers had become part of the clearing's ledger. Name, a voice, said from the far side, not hostile, not friendly. Takeshi, he answered. Old trouble. Another voice muttered, almost fond. A different man laughed once, brief and empty of joy, the sound of stone thrown into a bucket. The leader let the names and their echoes fall to the ground. "You've seen the valley," he said. "We have," Takeshi replied. "Then you know." "What question sits here?" The leader lifted his chin toward the banners without looking at them. "Loyalty. Or what men use when they cannot afford it." A man to the right of the leader, thin, eyes quick, scar down the forearm where a blade had taught him to respect the inside of a curve, leaned forward. "Loyalty bought my boy a winter," he said. "The next year, it bought a rope. The year after, there was no market. Loyalty," another said, heavier voice, "kept the road clear to the harvest gate when I was young. Now it keeps the road clear for carts with other men's names on them. Loyalty," a third, derisive, "is what they put on paper so paper can draw a sword." Laughter thinner than smoke. The leader raised his palm and lowered it. The circle obeyed, not by quieting, but by speaking more softly. "We are asked to tie ourselves to a post," he said. "Someone else chooses the rope. We have tied ourselves before. The post moves. The rope becomes an order we did not speak." Nobu drank and let the cup cool against his fingers. He watched each face briefly and fixed into memory details that would matter only if the words failed. The way a man touched the seam of his sleeve when he lied. A different man's habit of keeping his blade slightly drawn to ease his wrist. The quiet one with ears that had learned to collect words and store them whole. The owl spoke again, farther away, and drew an answer from the throat of a younger bird. "You came to speak," a voice to Takeshi's left said. "We've heard of your silence." A ripple moved, not laughter this time, something older. The leader said nothing. Takeshi set the cup near his knee. He did not reach for a story large enough to fill the clearing. He took instead the small bowl of truth the hour would hold without spilling. "I came to listen," he said. "Listening is a kind of speaking that pays in advance." "That pays who?" The thin man asked, curious and irritated and equal. "Measures. Whoever must carry the result," Takeshi said. "And you," the heavier voice put in, "who do you carry for?" "For the work," Takeshi answered. A short, derisive breath, then quiet. Fire made its slow decisions in the pit. Wet wood admitted defeat and then surprised itself by becoming flame anyway. "You have a name in the Lord's house," the leader said at last, or had. "What does loyalty weigh there?" Takeshi looked at the embers until the smoke kept his eyes honest. "What it weighs anywhere," he said. "What a man carries when no one writes his name. And when they do?" Someone asked from the shadow. "Then the writing is light," Takeshi said. "Or heavy," he added after a beat, "but for the wrong shoulders." A blade shifted in a sheath with a quiet scrape that traveled around the ring like a hesitation. The man who moved the blade was young for a ronin by the set of his neck, and the impulse in him that could not settle. He had tied his hilt in a way that kept his fingers from their preferred place and resented the knot for telling him so. "Words," he said, and did not finish. The leader did not look at him. "We will call," he began, and was cut by another voice, old and cracked, speaking through the side of the mouth as if a tooth ached. "I served under a captain who said every name of the dead," the old man said. He raised his blade to the sun for each and never repeated one. "We followed him without paper." He blinked into the fire for the shade of a face the light would not disclose. He was not paid enough to be a story. He died correctly and did not ask us to learn from it. I have not learned. Silence held, more respectful than any the clearing had practiced tonight. The smell of sake found its edge again and then retreated, replaced by the dry sweetness of a pine cone that had rolled too near the stones and decided to smoke instead of burn. Nobu let his breath match the fire's small surrender to weather, steadying in a place that allowed the pulse to be seen without being asked to hurry. "Tell us," the thin man insisted, unwilling to let quiet be the last word. "The valley gathers to a hand we do not like. Another hand sits at the fortress writing weather into the ledger, You will not speak for the one or the other. Takeshi shook his head a fraction. I will speak for the river at morning, he said. The ford will tell the room what the paper wanted to say. Riddles, the young man said, almost grateful for something to hit. Riddles and smoke. Smoke keeps the mosquitoes away, someone else said, out of humor that had not drunk enough to be brave. A cup traveled the circle and stopped at Nobu. He did not drink. He warmed his fingers and passed it along. The man who took it had a scar across his knuckles that looked like cracked ice. Honor, the man said, slow, as if remembering a word and trying it on, was a straight road when my father walked. He said, if your feet hurt, you were on the right path. Now the road moves, and the marks in the dust belong to horses and ever mounted. Honor, the heavy-voiced man countered, is a price set by men who do not buy their own rice. Honor keeps a village brave when tax collectors write the wrong month, said the quiet one at last, and the circle turned because the quiet one had found his voice. I have seen it. I have seen an old woman stand in a doorway with a broom because honor was the name she gave to her back. We pretend honor is a crest, she wore it as a spine. The leader let the words hang until they were no longer shiny, and then took them down gently. He turned to Takeshi. You know the hand that warms itself over paper, he said. You know the house that sits and the advisor who stands behind the sitting. You are asked by their silence to become their voice. We are asked by our hunger to become blades for whichever ledger agrees to count us. Either way, we wake with our names in someone else's mouth. He leaned a little forward. Will you ask us to stand with you when morning unknots the river? Takeshi did not answer. He listened as the owl called once and waited for a reply that did not come. He watched the fire notch down and then find a new piece of wood to teach. He let the smell of wet leather push against pine smoke and be pushed back. He looked at the men's hands, each different, and the same scarred, knuckles thickened, nails kept honest. A few polished by wealth once and now kept honest too late. He tasted the faint iron and the steam rising off armor hung to dry, the metallic tang of ink long set on paper that was tied to a pole nearby, curled with damp. Listen, he said at last. The storm that moves above us will end or will not end. The storm that men have set in the valley will not care what the sky does. If you tie yourselves to a post tonight, it will drag you if it moves. If you sleep as rope, someone will wake. You as chain. He met the leader's eye. Stand for the house when it behaves like a house. Stand only there. A breath then, if you must stand elsewhere, stand where the children drink. It was neither promise nor refusal. The men heard it as either or both, depending on the burden their backs preferred. A rustle moved around the ring, the sound of men choosing not to agree with themselves yet. The young man who had shifted his blade earlier leaned forward again, and this time the scrape was louder. The sheath complained with a cat's stubborn hiss. A half-inch of steel showed, drew light, and apologized for it. He smiled with one corner of his mouth in a way he might later learn to regret. Words are soft, he said. Steel is honest. Steel is honest about you, Takeshi said, not sharp, not slow. A few men let breath out through their noses. The leader turned his palm again, lower this time. The blade went home. The sheath corrected, agreed. We might be paid, someone else said, voice measured in the manner of men who have learned not to show greed too brightly. The advisor's men eat better than ours. Paper buys meat. Paper eats men, the quiet one replied, surprising himself with the courage to say it aloud. The leader brought the jar up, poured out the last 2 fingers, and set it down as if setting down a small, final opinion. We meet here because weather gives us permission to be honest, he said. Tomorrow, when the sun pretends to be authority again, some of us will be hungry enough to forget. Some will not. The house will count its grain. The valley will count its fires. The river will count nothing. He looked to Takeshi. You will watch the counting. If we are needed by the work, you will know where to find us. Takeshi dipped his head. He could hear Sayori somewhere behind the night storm, not from heaven, but from men, and kept that line folded under his tongue, like a small piece of dry cloth to bite when needed. He did not let it show. Nobu remained where he was, and let the clearing soak into him, the torch filings rising like sparks and then returning to ash, the owl's intermittent punctuation, the small scrape of a cup on stone, the long shy stroke of a whetstone drawn once on a blade and put away, the shift of a body on a pack, boots complaining lightly, the hiss and resignation of wet wood. He knew as he listened that he would remember each of these sounds when the morning asked for different ones, louder and less useful. The council did not end so much as loosen its circle. Men stood by the small labor of joints, the modest chorus of leather. Banners behind them breathed as the wind found its way back through the mats. Two men, without speaking, exchanged positions near the entrance, long swords laid with mouths toward their own bodies, a sign of trust that did not overpromise. Someone offered Nobu the last sip from a cup. He declined with 2 fingers and a bow of the head that honored both the gift and the need to keep his mouth clear of the smell. Outside the circle, in the edge of dark, a pair of figures slipped from tree to tree where the ground's memory of rain made each step a choice. They might have been latecomers or ears, or simply men who preferred the outer ring of any room. Nobu watched them until the trees reclaimed them and the smell of their breath went indistinguishable from damp soil. He understood without being told that every council has listeners who do not come to be seen. The leader rose last. The scar along his jaw made a different geography in the sideways light, the kind maps do not mark. He faced Takeshi without closing the distance. "Do not be surprised," he said, voice low enough for the owl to own it, "when those who speak of honor first speak of hunger next. I will be surprised only if they do not," Takeshi said. The leader allowed himself the ghost of a smile that had no teeth in it. "You will find our feet," he said, "near the work that keeps children drinking. If the house asks us to stand for its windows rather than its rooms, send your words to our fire, and we will hear them or refuse them correctly." He gathered his coat, tested the knot at his wrist, and turned from the clearing the way seasons turn by small, inexorable degrees. Men drifted out into the trees, scent domains closing behind them like shutters. Spearheads were eased into bundles. Armor swung on shoulder pulls, the dull clink of plates, the council's last minutes writing themselves into memory. The fire dimmed to 3 bright stones under wet sticks. One banner lifted, showed its ruined crest, and eased down again, as if embarrassed to be seen so clearly. The owl made no more notes. Its work was done. Takeshi did not rise immediately. He watched the ring of darker ground where men had sat, the way the rain already began to heal it back to forest. He set the cup exactly where he had found it and stood with the same economy he had used to sit. Nobu followed, the boy's eyes softer now that he had learned how much harder it is to make men agree in a storm than to hold a line in sundown. As they left the clearing, the smell of sake lost its edge, replaced by the clean cold of pine. Wind gathered modestly and moved and was done. Behind them voices resumed in pairs, the kind men use when they wish to revise the council's decisions in private. A blade rasped once in a sheath and stilled. A cough held and then coughed quietly. Cloth whispered. Leather remembered feet. They climbed back toward the ridge along a path that knew how to be discreet. Shadow took them kindly, then asked nothing, then let them pass. Between trunks, the valley presented its faint scatter of smothered lights bad. Stars behind bad weather, each fire under its lid, each lid a small promise that might be kept or thrown aside by daylight. The border outpost's torn banners answered the slack wind with a tired flap. Thunder, tired of instruction, rolled. Once without emphasis and settled dot and OBU kept silence and gave it work to do. He could feel in the clearing behind him loyalty set in thin slabs, over water, not entirely firm. It would hold a careful step, would betray a careless one. It would not bear the weight of a charge. He knew, too, how close to the fire the shadows had sat, the ones that bring news, and the ones that carry it elsewhere, the ones that belong to old debts, and the ones that invent new ones. He tucked these knowing places into the same sleeve where he kept his oilcloth and his temple coin and the short tie for hair, and he promised himself not to let them shake out in wind. Takeshi paused where the trees opened and let night draw a precise line across his face. He did not promise the men anything. He did not refuse them either. He had listened, and the listening had made a shape inside him that would not reduce to a word before morning. He could feel the ridge prepared to hold that shape the way it held rain. Accept it, let it run, keep a little of it in places no one would find without being taught. The owl cried once, behind them, then again farther off, as if it were leaving the council too. In the valley, the fires breathed. The smell of pine smoke thinned to a thought. Takeshi and Nobu stood for a breath and then another, and the storm, as if sealing whatever promise had just been made without being said, pressed a final brief sheet of rain across the ridge, a cool hand on hot words, then let it go. In the hush that followed, the truth about ronin outcasts with their honor, packed into narrow bowls that traveled badly, sat near the memory of the fire and waited for dawn, which is often the hour when a man decides what kind of loyalty he will afford himself. The clearing slept by halves. Men lay where the storm had left them, cloaks drawn to the chin, backs propped against roots grown glossy with rain. Mats sagged and wrung themselves along their edges, letting thin streams whisper into the trodden earth. The fire, persuaded to humility by weather and exhaustion, held only a low seam of ember under a roof of blackened sticks. Each time a drop slipped through the lattice and struck the coals, the bed answered with a hiss like a shushed word. Smoke lifted, not enough to be seen, only enough to make its presence known as a taste of the back of the throat. In the nearest, branches a weight of water gathered, held itself, and released. Counting a slow rhythm the night could keep, Takeshi sat apart from the ring and let the storm thin to its smallest self around him. Beyond the mats and the banner poles, the pines made a dark colonnade. Their trunks gave off a resin sweetness brought out of them by wet. The ground sent up its own breath loam, warmed by the passing of many feet, then cooled by rain until it smelled of patience. Somewhere low and almost behind his ear came the soft, habitual sound of a horse chewing. Somewhere else, the slick tap of a strap knocking a rail when a sleeping animal dreamed. From farther down the slope, the river's tone changed just enough to say that it had accepted more sky and would not be crossable by courage alone. Nobu slept near the embers. The boy had folded himself with more care than comfort, one hand under his cheek, the other resting on the scabbard's mouth, as if the blade were a door he had been put in charge of. When a gust pressed into the clearing and asked the embers to admit their color, the boy's face warmed and cooled in the space of a breath. Brown made red, red made brown again. His breathing kept time with the weather's gentler pulse, rising. When the rain lightened, settling when a passing sheet of it thickened the darkness between trunks. He did not stir when a drop found his hairline and traveled the path his thoughts had traveled before sleep. Temple to jaw to collarbone to cloth dot, Takeshi drew himself a little deeper under the low-slung limbs of a pine. The needles there made a roof fine enough to convince the drops to divide and seek other work. Only the smallest reached him, becoming the measure by which his skin understood the hour. He placed his hands on his knees and let them rest, palms down. He allowed the last voices of the council to leave the clearing one by one. Anger that had kept its edges too sharp to sleep, greed that had soft itself into excuses, a nostalgia that had borrowed a memory from a better year and stood in it until the rain pushed it out. He released each without asking it to return. The ember bed whitened along one side and settled, exhaling faint light that turned the undersides of needles into little knives and made the grain in the nearest pole stand up. Beyond, the torn banners drooped and breathed and made no claim to meaning. The crane on one, all but eaten by weather, presented a bare curve that might have been a wing or the first stroke of a letter. The strip of scorched cloth on another pole, the cross lines pressed into it as if someone had argued with ash hung still for a long minute, then lifted a finger's breadth and eased back, the storm's hand firm but polite. The smell of incense arrived when there was no reason for it, a thin, bittersweet thread that did not ask the night for space and yet found it. Takeshi did not look for its source. He let the smell take up a small quarter of the clearing the way a remembered song takes up the mind as one lifts a bowl, without insistence, with a kind of respectful inevitability. The breath that had been counting raindrops stopped counting and simply went in and out. On the ground, a pale thing caught the ember's small permission to be seen. He leaned forward and found a feather caught in a piece of grass one clean. White trained feather, rain-streaked, the barbs knit slick and shining. It did not belong to the hour. It did not belong to any bird that would willingly share itself with weather. A gust tried to take it. The grass kept it by one thread. He did not reach for it. He watched it the way he would watch a man who had chosen to stand still in a place not meant for standing. He watched it until its brightness grew ordinary. And then he lifted his eyes to the space over the embers where smoke made shapes as if it had been taught the alphabet of men and refused to use it. The glow under the sticks went lower, then widened again along a narrow vein, and the light found certain angles under the pine, drew them longer, and gave back to him a figure he knew as one learned to adore by the touch. Sayori did not appear so. Much as arrive in the way a room arrives when a man closes his eyes in it and opens them again. She was present where the ember made a soft hill and where a strip of wet bark curled away from its own tree. She was present in the pine's patience, and in the feather that had no right to be here, and in the small quiet that forms like a cup around a truth not yet spoken. The wind that stroked the clearing took on the weight her voice had the first time. Not sound in the air, but sentence in the place between flame and wood, between drop and moss. When she spoke, the night was already saying the same thing in its own dialect. Storm above. Storm below, she said. Takeshi did not bow. The room inside him did. Yes, he said, the word placed where the ember would not have to move to hear it. The hand that warms itself, she said, stays close to paper. Rain answered with a long, patient whisper on the mats, and for a breath the scent of oilskin rose from the sleeve where the sealed packet lay, as if reminded. He did not move his arm. The river will speak without your mouth, she said. Yes, listen, he did. He heard the river change from a line to a band, more ribbon than string. He heard a branch weight itself with water and choose to let go. He heard Nobu's breath cross a small boundary and return. He heard the ember's soft complaint when a drop found it. Beyond these, he heard nothing new, and yet everything changed its meaning, as if she had arranged the furniture of the sounds while he had been looking at the feather. Your brother, she said, and the clearing leaned in a degree, not with grief, with recognition. Takeshi's breath traveled lower, past the work and the hour to that room where the nick in the emblem had learned to be his thought. He did not bring Kazuo forward. The name came and sat without being asked. Rain grew softer for a dozen heartbeats, as if to make room for what might be said, and then resumed the labor the sky had given it. He left you a door, Sayori said. You have not stepped through. I stand in its frame, he answered. Then, it cannot be closed by other hands. The ember, persuaded by some private geometry, exposed a brighter vein and then covered it again, as if remembering that it had promised smallness to the night. Smoke drew itself into a figure that could have been a woman's sleeves or could have been nothing at all. Nobu turned his head toward the glow and away from it, choosing neither. Men will ask loyalty, she said. They will sell loyalty. They will rent loyalty by the night and return it wet. Takeshi let his eyes go soft so that the cloth with the burned emblem became only 2 strokes crossing, and the crossing became only the idea of intent insisting. Where weather might have preferred to remain in charge, stand where roofs stand, Sayori said. If a man asks you to stand where windows stand, teach him the use of doors. Asterisk, he said nothing. He watched the feather lift at its one caught, end and fall back. He listened for the owl and did not hear it. He was not sorry it had gone. Silence can shelter, she said. Silence can starve. Silence can be a blade. I know, he said, and the ember answered with that faint, contented crackle wood. Makes when it finds a way to burn in spite of a night determined to teach it humility. Do not cut your own mouth. She added, and there was almost humor in the breath of it. A breeze walked through the clearing and brought with it a whiff of ink. Not fresh, not wet, only the metallic memory ink leaves on the air when it has recently decided to be dry. Sayori's not voice took that thread and tied it to another. They will write what Rain wrote, she said, and call it theirs. The paper was there before we were, he said, and the river before both, she returned. The ember cupped itself deeper, and the smoke wrote a line so fine that only someone who had been waiting for it could read it. What of the boy? Takeshi asked, not the way a man asks for permission. The way one asks whether a path continues after the bend. Give him rooms, she said. He made himself a door tonight. He will need walls when others insist he should be a window. He looked at Nobu, whose fingers had found the scabbard again in sleep and were measuring it instead of holding it. The boy's mouth settled into the honest line of someone who had spoken a vow and now had to decide how to carry it. Takeshi saw, not for the first time, how the storm smoothed even a young face into the expression of older men. He let that observation remain in the place where such observations do useful work and not harm. Counsels, Sayori said, and the pine behind her gave off a stronger breath of resin as if to agree. Shadows near fire. Men speaking of honor. The way thirsty men speak of wells. He tasted Sake's ghost and Smoke's truth and did not argue. Listen longer than the boldest voice, she said. Trust those who set cups quietly. The feather shifted again and, freed at last, lifted from the grass and turned in the smallest wind. It rose the height of a hand and fell to a wetter patch, where it stayed without the grace it had had too. Breaths earlier, it looked no less white for lying in mud. Perhaps it looked more honest. Dago, he said, placing the name where her words could reach it. A window with a mouth, she replied. And a hand under the table. He let that be enough. The water in the branches ratcheted and fell as if a small lever had been pulled and released. The outpost will keep for one more day, she said, not because it is strong, because the storm wins at a gate. He saw the torn banners again in his inner sight, the way they had cracked at their edges in the last gust, and the men under them with their sleeves tied to the next hole. The memory sat well in the room where he kept such things. He did not move to adjust it. When the river speaks, Sayori said, softer, remember it is telling the truth to itself, not to you. There was comfort in that. He accepted it without the need to let it show. Do not sharpen anger. she said, repeating herself from other nights and making the advice new by placing it here. It will cut the stone as willingly as the rope. Yes, do not hoard patience as if it were rice, she said. Spend it where children drink? Yes, he said again. The ember sighed. The hiss of rain across the pit sharpened, then softened, like silk being pulled slowly across a table. A frog sent one syllable from a ditch and thought better of a second. Nobu drew breath a little deeper and returned to evenness. Through the gaps between trunks, the sky revealed no color and offered none, but the darkness wore its edges more loosely, as if a hand had been resting on the cloth and lifted it to set another weight beneath. Sayori's not voice altered in timbre, the way it did when her lines obliged themselves to prophecy rather than counsel. He felt this without anxiety. The night held enough room for words that could be born slowly. They will test you from the edge, she said. Not where you stand, where you do not. He watched the places he did not stand, 3 of them open like gaps in water when a man passes through and the stream thinks about remembering him. A blade waits under a good man's sleeve, she said. It does not belong to his hand. He saw a hand he trusted and a sleeve he did not. He let both find a place on the shelf where possible futures sit without accusation. Noise will call itself news. She added, almost with pity, then, we will keep the door shut, he said. Keep the window open to weather. She replied, as if to correct a child gently and thoroughly in one breath. He bowed not his head, but a thought. Do you ask a price for this? He asked, not because. He believed she did, because the question was part of the ritual that kept men humble. Only the same coin, she said, given in another market. He understood. He had no wish to understand more. A colder current of air slipped under the pine and lifted the smoke in a clean line. It streamed, drew a curve, and thinned to nothing between 2 branches. The incense note that had no source gathered briefly and then withdrew, leaving in its place the simpler honesty of wet bark and old ash. Sayori's presence shifted with it, from the exact place above the ember to the space just in front of Takeshi's chest, then to the feather lying in mud, then to the rain that learned his hair and decided not to carry it away. Her last line came without ceremony, placed into the clearing where even men who could not hear would behave as if they had. The silence will break with blood, she said, and the blade that rests will awaken. The ember measured the sentence with 1 brief brightness and returned to work. The feather took another sip of rain and made no reply. Nobu turned, sighed, settled. Takeshi remained as he had been, the world rearranged around the small weight her words had given it. He did not reach for the oiled packet in his sleeve. He did not lift the feather. He watched the embers show their ribs and then cover them. He listened for the owl and heard only water and the breath of sleeping men. Whether the vision had come from the night or from the room in him that had learned how to make nights into counsel did not matter. He would carry it as both gift and burden, because in weather the 2 often travel as one. He let his eyes lower until they made of the pit only a blur of warm and dark, then raised them again to count the trunks that would remain when morning arrived without color and asked for work all the same. The hiss of rain against dying embers wrote the last of the hour's script in letters so small they belonged to no alphabet at all, and Takeshi, neither comforted nor undone, kept his silence and let it be awake. The last folds of night lay heavy across the pines, the storm spent but not gone, its breath lingering as a fine mist that clung to bark and hair and the edges of steel. The clearing where the ronin had argued their way toward a temporary peace slept in uneven layers, men seated against roots with arms crossed, others under mats that had soaked and lightened, a few with eyes open, counting the distance between one drop and the next. Beyond the low mats hung to divert wind, embers kept. A red seam alive in the fire pit, a thin pulse that made the wet stones shine along one edge. A cup overturned, collected rain and released it in a narrow overflow. Banners, torn and tired, hung limply behind the racks of blades and spears, their devices softened to charcoal hints. Somewhere in the high canopy, a branch held a drop until it grew heavy, then let it fall with a single exact note. Takeshi stood at the rim of the clearing where the earth sloped toward the hollow path. The night touched his face with the cold sweetness of wet pine, the faint iron in the air that comes when steel sleeps and does not like it. Nobu stood a pace back and left, as he did now by habit more than thought, cloak drawn close, hands quiet against the scabbard that measured his breath. Sarai's warning moved through Takeshi as weather moves through a valley storm, not from heaven, but from men, and settled again. Not a voice, only a pressure behind the ribs, an instruction to read the silence as carefully as a map. The last owl call had come and gone. In its place, the close hush before dawn when the land counts itself. The storm's big grammar had diminished to footnotes, the soft sifting of mist and needles, the far patient tumble of water finding a new channel. Under stones, the leather sigh of a horse shifting its stance. A man's dream carried him to a laugh, then dropped him on his breath with a low sound that could have been worry or the correction of it. Even the fire chose not to write its brightness onto the men, keeping its work hidden, burning inward. Learning patience from what would dot, with that patience came the change. Nobu felt it before he heard it, the way the skin along the forearm knows a gesture approaching in the dark, a thinning in the mist, a gathered intent in the understory beyond the mats, a hush that was not hush at all but held breath. He shifted, the weight of his blade the width of a finger, and felt the scabbard mouth meet it, familiar and willing. Takeshi did not turn. He marked the last strip from a high branch and noticed that no other drop followed. The trees themselves seemed to lean in to listen. The first sign was not sight but sound, and not noise but the absence of one. At the far edge, where a path cut between ferns, crickets stilled too evenly, as if a hand had covered their song. Heartbeat later came the whisper no storm ever makes, the hiss of arrow fletching kissing wet air, a small blade of sound that unfurled and arrived. A mat at the windward edge fluttered and pinned itself as if ashamed. The shaft thudded in a bimmon, post with a dull, wet satisfaction. A sleeping man flinched. His hand found his blade and stopped there, as if all his training had pulled up along a line it knew better than his dreams did dot another hiss. A banner jerked, and the torn crane on it seemed to bend away from the strike, the cloth absorbing what good wood could not. A third lower struck the fire pit's edge, scratched a bright mark on stone, and slid into ash where a red seam licked it once and forgot it. Nobu's thumb eased the knot below the guard and held. Around the clearing, men rose into crouches with the quiet economy of those who have learned the price of waking fast. A cup fell and rolled, found a root, and stilled. Somewhere past the mats, a foot scuffed wet ground and corrected itself, a step too careful to belong to anyone who had been sleeping here. Left. Takeshi breathed, not louder than Miss Nobu moved with the word, 2 paces along the edge of the clearing where mats made a dark wall. He saw nothing yet, only the idea of shapes the mist wanted to admit and could not. The fire found itself a little and threw a close, low light along the nearest spear shafts, a brightness without warmth. Steel breathed quietly in their sheaths, the faint, intimate clink of fittings testing their ties. A horse down in the trees lifted its head and blew, a quick exhale that cut through fog and made another horse answer with a stamp. The arrows came in a short run, then stopped as suddenly as they had begun, as if a cautious hand had counted out a measure and refused to spend more. Silence held, and into that space slipped the scouts. Shadows loosened from shadows, cloth black with wet, faces wrapped to the eyes, blades held low, feet placed with the knowledge of which roots remember the last storm and which will betray. They did not shout. They did not need to. The night itself had done the calling. The first of them crossed the line of mats and met a spear that had been waiting. The spear's point did not lunge. It presented itself, an argument placed carefully in a doorway. The man swerved with a sound that was breath and effort and annoyance, and his shoulder brushed canvas with a soft rip. Torches on a rack where no one had asked fire for permission flipped into the mud. One caught briefly, then took a breath of water and sighed into smoke, flame struggling and then yielding. A flamelet licking one last tongue before becoming steam. Hold. The leader of the ronin murmured from the far side, the voice that had anchored the council now teaching the hush how to be firm. Steel found steel where two men, who had not expected to meet each other, did. The strike sounded like two bowls meeting softly in a kitchen, dampened by mist and purpose. A blade turned, read a wrist, and decided not to break it. A knee slid in mud and came up to find new purchase. Sake breathed from a jar kicked over. Rice swelled in the spill, each grain accepting water as if this, too, had been the plan all along. Nobu met the first man on his corner, a figure more silhouette than body. Blade short, intention long. He did not crowd the man. He let him arrive, guided the point past his sleeve with the guard, and felt the old tug in his arm where fear can make a hand foolish. He did what he had promised under the rock. He counted breath and made the edge. Honest, a small hiss, a correction. The man's blade rang once on the scabbard mouth and slid away without finding a home. Nobu stepped in, used the heel of the tsuba against the man's forearm, the way a carpenter uses the back of a chisel to remind wood of its grain, and heard the exact soft grunt of surprise. There was no space for anger. The night allowed only. Work dot to his right, Takeshi entered the narrow path between two mats and brought the weather with him. His blade left its house without brightness. When it met another, the sound was clipped and correct, as if both edges had agreed beforehand. To settle their argument with minimal testimony, mud climbed his sandals and stopped at the ankle. A hand reached from fog with a knife too thin for dawn. He caught the wrist and returned it gently to its owner, palm to palm, and the knife went into the ground instead, where the earth took its edge and said nothing. A scout reached the fire pit and kicked a lid aside with the urgency of someone who owed flame a favor. The embers flared and struggled under the new air, then licked wet wood without forgiving it. The scout thrust a torch in and raised it, shaking off hiss and sparkle, making a rude sun in a place not ready for it. The light revealed as much as it betrayed. Armor mended with 3 kinds of cord, faces set in the close focus of men who do not bring opinions to their hands. The torchbearer swung low, intending smoke to be a weapon. A spear tip kissed the torch's shaft. The wood split, flame showered mud, and died in a little applause. The smell changed, wet earth lifting into the nose, iron finding its line under it, smoke flattened and pushed aside by mist. The scouts moved with the confidence of men who had never been told no by darkness. The ronin answered with motions that had long ago learned to live without vindication. A blade hummed across a low circle and found nothing but air. 1 foot slid. Someone's breath hitched and made that small, naked sound a man makes when he discovers that he will still be alive in one more moment. Back edge, the leader said, and a pair of men at the far side shifted to close a seam. Leather complained, strap holes drew tighter. The old patient chorus of gear did its work. A spear shaft creaked under pressure, flexed, did not break. Another arrow came in from the trees, last of its siblings, struck a pole, shuddered, and stuck, its fletching soaked to the color of river stones. Nobu's blade met another with that damped ring. That makes a man want to apologize to his teacher. He stepped to firm ground his eye had found by instinct. He felt the mud's small pull on his heel and corrected for it. The scout in front of him wore a cloth across his mouth and nose that had once been white and now carried the knight's debts. The man fainted high, perhaps to test youth. Nobu did not rise. He let fear stand beside him as promised and did not ask it for instruction. He lowered his point, found the other's guard, and pressed, not to force, only to ask a question. The other man answered by retreating a step, and in that step the decision not to die tonight took shape. Nobu allowed it, and the pair shifted until their work belonged to the wider circle again. At the clearing's edge, a scout tripped on an exposed root made slippery by the storm. He fell without drama, rolled toward a trunk, and a ronin standing there put the tip of a blade where a throat would be if the work asked for it. It did not. The ronin's blade hovered, a sentence waiting for a verb. The fallen man saw the choice and took it. He scrambled back, left his knife in the mud where it made a small, soft mouth, and vanished toward the darker edge where mats did not reach. Through all of it, the night refused to become a spectacle. Sound arrived, finished itself, and withdrew. Steel spoke in brief, muffled exchanges. Torches gasped in mud and sometimes regained their breath. Rain returned in a fine weave and then paused again to listen. Voices ran like quiet wires between men, left, close. A name spoken once, not pleaded, only placed where it would be reached. Nobu heard Takeshi say, "Breathe," and realized he had forgotten to. He did as told. The blade in his hand felt more like a tool and less like a temptation. The scouts found no center to pierce, no proud banner to cut down and show to a captain later. Only men sitting in their own weather and refusing to give the night anything loud. To carry, they pressed once more three together, nearest the stacks of spears, where the torn crane hung, and for a moment the clearing tilted. A spear cracked. Its head swung on its lashing like a pendulum. A man staggered. Another filled his space with a shoulder. Takeshi stepped in, not with speed, with timing. His blade touched 2 points in order, not hard, precisely, and the pressure broke like a wave that had misread the shelf below it. A shout finally came, from the understory behind the mats, not from pride or command, only to collect the scattered. The scouts began to melt back along the paths by which they had entered, not running, not walking, a retreat learned from rain continuous and unsentimental. One of them, in anger or instruction remembered too late, thrust a torch deep into a stack of wet reeds to get a flare. The reeds coughed sparks and spit up steam. The torch hissed and died. Another, at the far rim, reached to tear a banner's fringe for a prize. The cloth came away in a rag that stuck to his wet hand and made him drop it in disgust. The rag lay in the mud like a rejected word. "Let them go," the leader said, and his men obeyed the part of the order that felt like their own thought. Nobu did not chase. He let the noise move away from him, let the night reseal its seams. He stood with his blade lowered, point angling toward earth, and found, with a mild surprise, that his hands trembled more gently than in the past. The tremor seemed less an enemy now, more a measurement of what he had agreed to carry. He felt rain return as a fine brush across his hairline. He listened hard for the last scout's weight and heard only water leaving needles. Silence rebuilt itself from small stones. It began with the breath of men, drawn in, let out, drawn again. Then the horses, who lowered their heads and resumed the honest work of being animals. Then the night creatures, coaxed back into their sentences by a world that had not asked their permission. The fire, which had sat humble throughout, found a place it could inhabit and lifted 2 flames, precise and unassuming. The smell of wet earth filled the clearing with an intimacy that ignored whether men were worthy of it. Iron kept its metallic edge in the nose, not bright now, settled. a reminder that tools had been used and put back to their places. Loss made itself known by the space it left. A man sat by the fire with a sleeve darkened at the upper arm, pressing cloth to a wound that did not require drama. Another had fallen and would not rise. He lay half under a mat that had slid from a pole during the first hiss of arrows. His face had the peace of someone remembering a river correctly. His sword remained sheathed. Two men knelt beside him without. Ritual, heads lowered, not to pray, only to ensure he could keep what he needed for the road beyond this one. A third limped to the spear stack, touched each shaft with 2 fingers to honor the one that had cracked, and then tied the lashing against further betrayal. Nobu sheathed his blade. The mouth of the scabbard gave that small, decent sound, a punctuation for hours that preferred to end without flourish. He turned and found Takeshi standing with his hand on the post the arrow had pinned earlier. Takeshi eased the shaft out with a short motion that offended neither the wood nor the thing the wood had become. He set it aside where it could remind. "No one of more than it must count," the leader said to a man with a ledger's face, and the man did, eyes moving, lips not. He pointed twice, once to the edge where a gap had opened and been closed, once to a place where someone had left. A cup Ben should not have. He lifted the cup and returned it to the ring of stones, a quiet correction. That meant much more than that Nobu had drained from his brow, and tasted the clean tang as it ran to his lip. He thought of Sayori's line, "The storm that gathers not," from heaven, but from men, and felt how exactly the hour matched it. A narrow fight had passed, neither glorious nor negligible, the kind that rearranges intentions without changing anyone's story enough for later singers. He felt the work step nearer, not the battle those intents prepare for with paint and poems, but the steady tasks of weather and steel. Stand, watch, mend, carry, breathe. The clearing accepted dawn without asking the sky for color. Light arrived. As a softening, a thinning of shadow within shadow. Trees changing from walls to pillars, faces resolving along lines the fire had not found. Fog lay against the ground like a breath no one had decided to take back. Rain retreated to the heights. To reconsider. The torn banners lifted by a finger's width and then settled, edges heavy with water. On one, the crane's remaining lines appeared for a moment sharp, then blurred again as light found the steam rising from the mud below it, dot beyond the mats. The path the scouts had used showed itself as a twice-darkened strip, prints already. Filling with water as the earth did what earth does, remove information. A broken torch lay at the rim of the pit, its charred end seamed with bright threads of dew, as if the night had decided to make it new by a degree and then stopped caring. The smell of wet pine thickened as needles warmed and released what they had held since evening. Horses chewed, working at hay that tasted of earlier weather. Takeshi stood where the clearing opened to the valley. He did not clean his blade with ceremony. It had not made a mess of the hour. He did not speak. He watched the horizon think about morning and declined to help it. Nobu came and stood a step back and to the left and let his breath learn daylight. Again, around them, men moved with the modest sounds of those who have lost a little and will name it later in the correct room. A strap pulled through a buckle, a mat shaken and reset, a stone rolled with a toe to make water go somewhere else, a cup refilled without asking by whom dot on the far ridge the border. Outposts showed torn banners against a sky the color of unpolished steel. No color in the light, only values. Smoke rose from the yard and lay down quickly. The river, still hidden by fir and thorn, made itself known by its tone alone fuller perhaps than at midnight, a hint that the ford would not keep the days. Promise easily. In the basin where the enemy fires had breathed, a few smudges dulled themselves, patient. New ones would be made when men decided they could not tolerate wet sleeves any longer. First tremor, the leader said, arriving beside. Bem with a hand on his side as if to keep something sensible there. He did not ask for Takeshi's agreement. He watched the pale rise of light with a look that had learned to be honest about statistics. They will test the other rims next. Let them, Takeshi said, not in challenge, in fact. Nobu glanced toward the place where the fallen man lay. He had been lifted and set under 2 branches now, a mat pulled to his chin, his blade laid across him with the mouth toward his own body. The old courtesy extended even when it will not be noticed. 2 friends sat near, not speaking. The fire offered them heat without interrogation. Breeze came from the west, carrying the smell of damp loam and the faint sourness of extinguished torches. In it, some trace of parchment warmed, perhaps, and pressed last night under a seal clung and passed. Nobu thought of the oiled packet still in Takeshi's sleeve, and of the words that had not chosen sides. The line between warning and invitation remained where it had been. He left it there. Dawn completed its work without spectacle. The sky refused pinks and golds and offered instead the exact color of intention. The ground in the clearing took on the dull shine of trampled mud, prints crossed and erased, a palimpsest of choices. The torn banners hung at angles that told their own story about wind and argument. Torches lay where they had fallen, some in halves, ends square cut by wet failure. Water pooled in shallow cups in the earth and reflected nothing but cloud. Takeshi's gaze stayed on the horizon, as if it might admit a line the rest of them could not see. He did not search it. He allowed it to carry what it would carry. Beside him, Nobu's shoulders lowered by a degree that had nothing to do with fatigue. The boy's hands had stopped their trembling. Or rather, they trembled now in a way the body recognizes honest work's residue. A signal not to boast and not to hide. Low behind them, someone fitted a new head to the cracked spear shaft and tested the lashing with a pole that made the fibers sing. A blade was drawn once across a stone with the care of a man who knows the hour does not deserve brilliance, only readiness. Cups were set in a line and filled from a pot that had decided to be water again. The clearing rearranged itself into a room where people could stand and not be asked to justify their standing. The scouts had gone. The quiet they had ruptured resumed. The day, pale and colorless, admitted itself across the valley. Takeshi did not move forward or back. He let the first work of morning pass through him and be sorted where it belonged. He held his stillness the way stone holds weather without, argument with memory. And when a thin, indifferent wind lifted the edge of a broken banner and let it fall, he accepted that this had been only the first tremor, a message not of glory but of accounting, and that the ledger, kept by river and ridge and the hands of men, had many lines yet to be written. The morning did not brighten so much as pale. Color withdrew to the undersides of leaves and the interiors of stones, leaving the world in a scale that favored silence over display. The clearing where the night attack had struck rearranged itself. Without remark, mats were lifted and rung, then laid again in straighter lines. The cracked spear from the far rim accepted a sound lashing and held. A cup found its place on a flatter stone than last night. A cloak was folded over a fallen man with the mouth of his blade turned inward toward his body, an old courtesy extended. With clean hands, smoke climbed low from the pit and then lay down as if it had remembered the duty of weather and chosen to assist Takeshi. Stood at the edge of this repaired room and looked down the slope where the path bent toward the river. Nobu came to him, a step back and left, the rhythm of their arrangement as natural now as breath. Around them, the ronin gathered into smaller knots that would become a line when asked. The leader patched sleeve, jaw scar that held its geography. Without apology, spoke once to a man counting straps, once to another tying a pack, then came with the rest. No one had slept enough, no one said so. The night's sweat had made steel honest and the ground forgiving in a way that does not last beyond dawn. They moved when the light settled into its pale decision. Footsteps sank a thumb's breadth into mud that tried not to remember them and failed. Each lift of a heel made a soft answer as if the earth wished to keep what it could for later. Wind carried the damp sweetness of crushed grass and the faint sour of extinguished torches. Banners salvaged from the clearing torn, indifferent to glory hung from poles at the rear of the column. They did not announce anything. They traveled, like tired shadows being given a ride. The path entered a cut where pines leaned toward each other. Needles, heavy with water, brushed shoulders, then raised themselves again in modesty. Somewhere ahead, a crow called twice, and, when unacknowledged, called no more, as if a point had been made. The men walked without speaking. When they did, it was to say stone or slick, or step quietly to the man behind. Leather found its squeak and lost it. Iron breathed through cloth in brief, metallic edges. Nobu counted those edges, because counting kept his breath honest. The counting made him aware of a quickness under the ribs. He let it exist and gave it no orders. At the milestone shrine they paused. Not to pray men who have not eaten, do not prolong the time between now and later, but to stand where the house once met the road in humble agreement, the rope before. The greened bell hung heavy with rain and the scent of old hands. Prayer slips, loosened at one corner, lifted and fell, lifted and fell. The sound like fish mouths touching the water's surface and a childhood memory. The small square burned with cross strokes, the mark that had begun to appear everywhere ink wished to pretend it was weather, clung to the eave, edges blackened. Takeshi placed his palm on the lintel just once, not as petition but as inventory. He did not take the oiled packet from his sleeve. He did not need to see the seal to know its weight. The ford had grown shallow overnight, or perhaps the men had gained a better eye. The river, truer to itself in daylight, combined a new fullness with the old habit of widening where men needed it to be narrow. Stones showed as darker plates under lighter water. They stepped into it one by one, following the memory of footprints that had already been erased. Nobu felt the cold climb his feet and offer his bones a more serious attention. He kept his blade high and his gaze lower, watching what water does when it resists and when it consents. Halfway over, wind leaned into their backs and made a sheet of ripples run ahead of them. The sound was like ink being blown across paper. They came out on the far bank with trousers dark and ties set one hole tighter. Past the ford, the path steepened, then eased into a long shelf where thorn gave way to reed and reed to a scoured apron of bare earth. Somewhere beneath that earth ran the old row-packed, layered, forgotten. Its work was still visible in how the land agreed to accept weight. Men who had once marched here had not needed to look up. These men did. The fortress rose where a hill had decided to be more than a hill. Stone set into stone until it was unclear where rock stopped serving itself and began to serve the idea of a room. That would not be moved. The walls emerged from mist as if grown, not made. Dark with rain, they did not shine, they absorbed. Channels cut to carry water worked their quiet math along the courses, drops stitching themselves into threads that disappeared at intervals into mouths meant to swallow such talk. Era slits held their dark quite well. The gate tower wore its eaves like a hat too heavy for the morning, dripping steadily at each corner. The banners above the inner parapet hung limp and wet, Kensei's crest rendered stubbornly by dye that refused to surrender to weather. The cloth's weight had turned them into pendulums marking the hour by no clock. Crows circled above that crest in patient black geometry, trading perches and remarks without urgency. Their voices fell and flat, syllables that the stone received and did not echo. The ronin grew quieter as the walls grew larger. There is a point beyond which words are out of their depth. The fortress kept that point close to its skin. The leader came to Takeshi's side without ceremony. "We will stand as guests," he said, the line spoken as if one says, "Weather." "From the west." "As guest," Takeshi agreed. "Or not," the leader added, just enough to finish the thought. Nobu heard their voices and felt the quickening in him sharpen to a higher hum. He lowered his breath to meet it, as if calming a tea about to boil. Mud took the next step from his sandals more greedily. He pushed down, and it made a soft, forgiving complaint, the sound of a floor that has held too many feet without deciding. Any of them mattered more than the rest. At the apron's near edge, a watchman appeared on the parapet, a small figure inside too much architecture. He moved as men move who know that any gesture can be misread. He leaned on the rail and did not call. Another joined him, and a third, and they arranged themselves into the geometry of observation without the punctuation of appeal. The air between men and walls took on the feeling of a page waiting for the first brushstroke. Wind, which had been content to occupy itself with pine and reed, came forward to test the gate and was refused entry like a polite guest arriving early. They stopped at a distance. No one could argue with close enough for the guards to see faces, far enough for any suddenness to die before it learned its name. The line the ronin formed had no banner at its heart. It had no heart, only lungs, men drawing air evenly, turning their heads once to count who stood, then facing forward. The leader let his hand fall to his side. Nobu stood where he always stood, the left shoulder's width back, the left foot half a step behind, his breath the size of the space in front of him. "Do we call?" He asked, the question hesitant and formal at once. "The house hears its own footsteps first," Takeshi said. Silence gathered itself, a cloth drawn over a table. The crows above the gate tightened their circle, then loosened it. Within the walls, gear made the modest music of another room preparing chain lifted. A pin checked, the whisper of a bowstring being tested. A clerk's brush tapped once against a stone. None of it came forward into accusation. The fortress had long practice offering the world an unhelpful face. A small procession approached along the interior wall, 2 men carrying a chest between them, a third with a pole and helped to lift something that did not wish to be lifted. They stopped on the platform above the gate and worked at what needed working at. No herald. No banner settling itself with a performative sigh. Only the practical motions of people who would like a morning to become an afternoon in one piece. The chest was set down. The pole found its mark. A rope's weight shifted behind the gate. The sound came thickly, wood speaking to wood through intermediaries, patient, sure, unhurried. Nobu watched a drop fall from the lower edge of the leftmost banner. The drop waited until it had gained a perfect roundness, then slipped and traced a straight line on its way down, leaving a darker path on stone that the next drop would not care about. He followed its descent until it died in mud without ceremony. He found in that brief observing enough to slow his pulse to an honest number. "Breathed," he said in his mind, then corrected the word back to breathe, and did so. "Messenger," the leader said softly, as a reminder of a past hour rather than a present demand. "He came and went in weather," Takeshi answered. He let his gaze travel along the length of the wall until it returned to the gate. The watchman above it had taken on patience. One lifted the collar of his coat with 2 fingers and put it down again, nothing more. Somewhere inside, an order moved at the pace of ink. Somewhere else, something faster-paced hunger, fear, or loyalty insisted it should be listened to first. The fortress weighed both against the weight of its own habit and decided not to be rushed. They stepped forward 3 paces, not to be nearer, but to allow the mud behind them to begin forgetting. Boots sank and pulled free, tore a soft section that sounded like decisions refusing to let go until they were given a better room. The ronin, behind breathed as one breath for a moment and then separately again. Nobu touched the cord below his guard and found it as he had left it, true. The feather from the knight's vision, a white line in wet grass, returned to him then, not in sight, in the feel of the thing that does not belong where it is, and teaches a man to pay attention without putting his hand on it. The walls reached their full height, not through scale alone, but through the behavior of everything around them. The trees at the base went quiet, the reeds lowered. Even the mist stood straighter, as if summoned to behave. Rain returned, slight, a fine combing of the air that wrote itself on hair and sleeve, and the small exposed skin at the throat. The stone took it without complaint. The crest above, for all its dye's endurance, looked tired of being red. A lone crow crossed low from right to left, then climbed and circled as if remembering a different instruction. There will be words, the leader said, not expecting an answer. There will, Takeshi said. He felt Sayori's line weigh itself in his pocket of thought. The silence will break with blood. The blade that rests will awaken. He placed it where it would not argue with what the sky now offered, a gray correctness and the honest weight of wet cloth. Nobu's breath, which had been a house he kept near, went shallow once without his permission. He allowed the breach and fixed nothing, just stood in it until the body remembered how to lower the air again. He felt the appetite for noise move through the men behind him and die in the place where mourning keeps such hungers from getting out of hand. A spear butt shifted in mud. A hand tightened and then loosened on a strap. Water ran in little rivers between footprints, the map changing as one watched. Time slowed to the speed that stone prefers. A single bell inside the wall tried one note. It did not repeat itself. The sound died soft, held by damp air until even the crows refused to carry it farther. Takeshi stepped a half-pace forward and stopped where the world seemed to want him. He placed his right hand where it always rested, in reach of the knot that remembered the blade, but did not change the angle of his wrist. He lifted his eyes, the length of a man's height, and found the underside of the gate's beam, dark with oil and rain, carved by time into a sheen that had no desire to impress. "Master," Nobu said, voice so quiet that even the mist might have missed it. "Do we wait?" "We do," Takeshi said. "For what?" "For the house to decide what it is," he answered. A wind came from beyond the hills with the damp taste of fields, turned at the wall, and went sideways. The banners above did exactly what wind asked and nothing more. The watchmen on the parapet refused to be statues by the smallest margin, shifting weight in a way that admitted each man had knees. Inside, the chest was moved to another place on the platform and set down. A clerk raised a brush to a piece of wood to make a mark. That would be read by a man who would say a word that would be carried down. A ladder to a man who would tell another man to lift a bar. The order, like a drop growing heavy on the banner's edge, took its time. The ronin waited with them. Their faces, in this light, were variations of the same acceptance, the knowledge that a gate has its own weather and that men are small within. Some thought of payment, some of a child's bowl, some of a crest worn thin by time, some of nothing at all except the curve their blade would need to take if the world broke its silence the wrong way. None of this moved the wall. That was the point of a wall. Crows shifted again, impatient with a morning that refused to give them a narrative. One flew low over the group and then rose, turned, and joined the others. Its call dropped once, flat, then lost interest. Rain tapered to a finer hand. The mud underfoot began to learn men's weight in more detail, offering each a slightly different resistance as if to remind them that no step is the same step twice. Takeshi's hand remained where it was, neither nearer nor farther from the sword. His left hand opened and closed once to ease a thread in the wrist. The movement made no sound. He allowed his gaze to travel from the crease where a wall met earth to the notch in the beam above the gate, A notch everyone had learned and no one had made alone. He let words that wished to be spoken organize themselves and then asked them to wait. He remembered the messenger's sentence, "Weather first," and felt the morning prove it. No horn sounded. No challenge came. There was decision enough in the way the men on the parapet did not move, and in the way the air held itself. The gate remained closed, wood dark with rain, iron stained by years of honest water. The bar within sat where bars sit, at ease and potential. The fortress wore its intention as stone wears wet. Fully, without decoration. They did not draw steel. They did not abandon it. They stood, the master and the apprentice, the leader and his men, their feet set in mud that kept small, faithful copies of their weight. The clouds pressed low as if to carry the ceiling closer, and the breath of crows marked the vertical measure left to them. Nobu listened to his own breathing until it was the right size for the room. And then he listened to the wall breathe. Yes, walls do this. And then he listened to the silence between those two breaths. He found it heavy and exact. They had come as far as they could with steps. The rest would require decisions that lived behind wood and under seals. The storm, which had rolled the hours, let the last of its patience run a slow hand across banners and hair and the top of the gate. Takeshi looked up once more, his hand resting lightly near the knot that knew his blade, and did not draw. The fortress offered no change in expression. The gate remained closed. The morning held there, thick and undecided, like the pause before. A clerk reads a name aloud in a low room. What waited inside would choose where the weather of men would turn, and outside, in the clean weight of listening, they accepted that the path before them belonged for this breath to the house.